but excellent. So welcome back to Zohar Learning. I'm going to start tonight by trying to do a little bit of a very brief intro to the Zohar for those who maybe haven't heard it before. For those who have heard it before, I'm really sorry, and I'll try and go speedily. But then we're going to hopefully get a chance to look at some text. And generally, what I'm going to aim to do with these classes, and hopefully we'll get a nice group going every other week on Monday nights, is to look at a portion of the Zohar that's somewhat connected to either the season or a festival that's upcoming or the Torah portion. So tonight we're going to look at something from the beginning of Exodus, which we're reading this past week and this coming week, of course, in Shul. Quickly, though, before that, in case it's useful to anyone, hello, Jeff. The Zohar itself may not be obvious what it is. So I just want to say a little bit about that. In some ways, the Zohar is a book, but it is an awful lot more than a book. It's not conventionally a book in the sense that someone wrote it down with a beginning and a middle and an end and intended it to be a book. More accurately, it's an anthology of a variety of texts, most likely from a variety of authors, most likely compiled in the 13th century in Spain, but written over the 1,000 years before that. Some of it may be genuinely from around 300 CE or even a bit earlier. Most of it is probably later, and some of it is probably from the 13th century in Spain when someone finally sat down, or a group of people sat down, to put it together into a semi-cohesive work. I say semi-cohesive because actually it's a huge mess. The Zohar is trying to do several things at once. It's trying to be a midrash. A midrash is a work which attempts to fill in the gaps in the Torah that are not explained by the story. And the Zohar, in a sense, is one of those. It's one of many, and it's one of the latest if we look at it chronologically, but it's trying to be a midrash. So it goes through each parasha in the Torah and offers commentary, trying to explain what things mean and what's going on behind the scenes. Often it doesn't make much sense as a midrash because the commentary it's trying to offer is not necessarily clear. So in addition to being a midrash, it's also in some way a code. So the Zohar is talking about something different than what it seems to be talking about more frequently than not. Often the code is regarding the system of the Sfirot, which we'll get to know a little bit as we take a look at the Zohar, but we're not going to go too much into tonight. And it's also often connecting with other mystical ideas that circulated in the time and place in which it was composed / compiled. That is, of course, 13th century in Spain. And that means that at the time and the place, there was a lot of mysticism going around. A lot of that in the Christian and the Muslim community focused on different approaches to religion, sometimes very controversial ones. The Zohar was largely compiled by people who lived in the Christian part of Spain. But during the 12th, 13th, 14th century, Spain was largely a battleground for the wars between Christianity and Islam. And depending on where you lived in Spain, at different points, you were either in Christian Spain or Muslim Spain or back and forth if you were close to where the battle lines were drawn. The Jews who put together the Zohar were largely in the Christian part, largely in the north, largely in what's today Catalonia or Castile. And as a result, they had a lot more contact with their Christian colleagues. And in many ways, the Zohar resembles similar things that were happening in Christianity at the time. For instance, the influence of what's called Marianic Christianity, that is, the sudden and extreme interest in the figure of Mary, mother of Jesus, Virgin Mary, the cults focused on Mary that sprung up very suddenly in this time. It's not a coincidence at the same time that all of those communities were developing, which had a very feminine understanding of God. The Zohar is also talking about God in both masculine and feminine ways, in ways that many people find quite shocking. So the Zohar is teaching ideas which are not new, but are nonetheless quite radical for many conventional Jews. Its attempt is to claim these ideas are in fact tradition, not counter to tradition, but it's obviously aware of the danger and significant radicalness of many of them in that it tends to kind of encode them in other ideas and in obscure language. In addition to being a commentary / midrash on the Torah, the Zohar is also a novel in a sense, in the very medieval sense, like the Canterbury Tales is a novel, in that it follows a group of rabbis as they travel around the land of Israel and they have adventures and they meet people, and in the people they meet and the conversations they have, the teaching takes place. So there is a somewhat fictional framing to it. The fictional framing is set in the 2nd century among a real group of rabbis who did actually live, particularly focused on one individual named Shimon Bar Yochai. He was, as far as we know, a real individual. He was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and he was someone who is quoted many times in the Talmud, in the Midrash, in mainstream Jewish texts. So he's not just in the Zohar, but the Zohar imagines itself to be telling the story of himself, his sons, his disciples, and their adventures. So he becomes the protagonist of the story. And many of the teachings that are most radical are offered in his name, which of course gives them more credence. The Zohar, as a result, is written in a kind of bizarre and largely artificial form of Aramaic, not Hebrew. Aramaic being the language that was spoken, the lingua franca, for lack of a better term, in the 2nd century among Jews, including rabbis. But the Aramaic of the Zohar is so weird that scholars have largely established that actually it's not from the 2nd century, and the Aramaic is a way of covering the origin of the Zohar by making it seem older than it is. So this was a common maneuver in the medieval period, that people would write books pretending like they were ancient books they just discovered, but they actually wrote them in their own time, or at least put them together or compiled them in their own time. It's called pseudepigrapha, means fake author, obviously. And it was a very common phenomenon. And the Zohar is part of that. How much so and to what extent, I don't really care. And scholars can debate it all day long. But actually, what's important to us is that once the Zohar was published, let's say around 1300, it totally changes Jewish life, because all of a sudden you have a mainstream, normative, and public version of what was previously private and secret teachings, which gets called Kabbalah eventually, which means reception. And the Zohar becomes the kind of masterpiece anthology of Kabbalistic ideas. Although Kabbalah develops much from where the Zohar is in later time, everything that is Kabbalah has some root in the Zohar largely. And many of the ideas that are still today considered to be Kabbalistic ideas are ultimately traced back to the Zohar and to Shimon Bar Yochai, whether historical or not. The version of the Zohar we're going to be looking at is an English translation, the only valid English translation that was done over the last 20 years by a professor named Daniel Matt, who's an excellent human being and an excellent translator and scholar. And he spent 20 years subsidized by the Pritzker Family Foundation in San Francisco, translating the Zohar and supervising a team of translators. The result is that we have probably the best critical edition and best translation from Aramaic into any language, including Hebrew. And so actually there's very little point in studying the Zohar in Hebrew, for instance, because that itself is a translation from the Aramaic. And although there's a nice benefit to reading it in the Aramaic, actually the Zohar isn't about the words as much as it is about the ideas. So it's far more important that we understand what we're reading. And Daniel Matt's English translation is excellent in helping us understand what we're reading, particularly in excellent footnotes. I have all of the paper versions in my office, and previously when we've done these sessions, I've copied off pages and put them on the screen, and they're often very wonky. This evening, and hopefully for the time being, actually have found, thanks to Danny Matt partially, EPUB versions of all of the published Zohar works. So it's much easier to read in a much more digital format. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. And what we're going to do is just try and read a passage and discuss it and translate. Well, not translate, it's already translated, but we got to translate it into actual real English, because you'll find it doesn't make much sense. And hopefully try and get some insight into what the Zohar is trying to teach us, particularly about this passage from Parashat Shemot, which is what we read this previous Shabbat. Any questions about that before we dive in? Cool. Okay, so this relies on volunteer readers. If you don't volunteer, I will call on you. But it would be better if you volunteer. And what we're going to check is just that everyone can see this. And so I'm going to share my screen. And can I get a thumbs up if you can see that and it's big enough to read? Yeah. The best thing about an EPUB is that we can change the font size, we can change the way it displays, and we can change the color. We can make it much more accessible depending on what is useful. The other benefit of doing it this way is we don't see the footnotes. So we can just read it as it is. And if we want to read the footnotes, we can, but they don't take up the whole page as they conventionally do in the published version. Okay. So.
Rabbi, could you make the font just a little bigger, please?
Yeah, not a problem. That's the benefit of EPUB. How we doing? Is that better? Does that look better? Is that a yes? Yeah? Okay. Sorry, Beverly, you put yourself back on mute. If that was you, I couldn't hear you. Um, right, any volunteers to read first? We're going to start here where it says a new king arose. This is, of course, a passage from our reading this past Shabbat, in which it describes a new king arising over Egypt who doesn't remember Joseph. And we're going to see what the Zohar's question is and how they address it. And we're going to see actually in this passage both the way in which the Zohar comments on the Torah and also the way in which it tells a story about these rabbis who we come to know and maybe love, maybe resent a bit. So who wants to start reading for us? I can't see everyone at once, so you may have to just take yourself on mute and shout out if you're keen.
Shall I start?
Was that you, Beverly?
Okay. Yeah, that's me. Sorry, Beverly.
Yes, excellent.
Okay. Rabbi Yosef said, every day the Blessed Holy One makes angels messengers to the world, as it is written. He makes his angels spirits. It is not written he made, but rather he makes, because every single day he makes them. At that time, a certain prince was appointed over Egypt. And so it is written, a new king arose. Really new.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to pause you there. First of all, you'll notice that the italics here indicate a biblical verse where something is being quoted. And thank you for emphasizing that. And it's also being used to indicate emphasis in the conventional way sometimes. So that makes it a bit tricky to tell. But we have two ideas here, one of which is obvious and the other of which is not. So idea number one is what?
Before you go into the ideas, I've got a question.
Yeah, go on.
When it says he makes angels, and then there's the comma, messengers to the world, and then another comma, is that an explanation of what angels are, i.e. the angels are messengers to the world? Or does it mean he makes angels, and what he makes them do, he makes the angels be messengers to the world, if you understand my...
Yeah, no, I do. So because we don't have the Aramaic in front of us, we're somewhat reliant on Danny Matt's English grammar in terms of him trying to convey to us the meaning. And I think in this case, it's going to be the first, the way that it's structured as an independent clause. Every day the Blessed Holy One makes angels, that is, messengers to the world, as is written. And of course, the surprising part here, maybe surprising, maybe not, is the idea that God is making new angels every day. I mean, have you ever thought about it before? Whether God made all the angels before or whether there's new angels being made all the time? I haven't. But it's taking a very strong stance here on this idea that new angels are made all the time. It's trying to prove it by citing Psalm 104. He makes his angels spirits. And of course, it relies on the present tense verb there of makes instead of the past tense made. Yeah, Beverly.
I thought that there was only perfect and imperfect in the Torah. And which would be
so I believe we can look at the verse, but I believe it probably says ose. So it does use the participle, what we would call the present tense.
Okay.
Which is used sometimes. And as you remember, right, the participle can also describe a noun as much as it can a verb. So if it does say ose melachim, and someone would have to look it up for us, you could read that as much angel maker as an individual, as well as you could makes angels. So cute little idea, right? God makes new angels every day. I don't know, something about that is very endearing to me, the idea that there's kind of new angels coming off the factory line all the time. But the question probably is lingering in our minds, how does that address the verse which is quoted, which is a new king arose? That's what we're trying to explain. And that's where the second part comes in. What's going on in the second part?
Is it suggesting that the new king is somehow connected with the angels?
Very good, Lorraine. Yes, absolutely. So it's reading the new king arose, not about the physical king of Egypt at all, but about an angel. Now, what you won't see here, but what the Zohar is assuming you know, is that there's a very old Midrashic idea that's cited very often in Midrashim, that each nation of the world has an angel appointed over it. Right, so there's 70 nations historically. That's how it's understood. Each one has its own angel. So Egypt has an angel, and Babylon has an angel, and Turkey has an angel, and everybody gets an angel. It's kind of like there's some giant parliament in the sky, and each nation has an angel that represents them, that protects them, a kind of a nationally specific angel, except for the nation of Israel in the Midrash, who does not have an angel that supervises them, but is directly supervised by God. That's the point of the Midrash, right? Is everyone else gets kind of inferior angels as their spiritual guides, but we have God directly one-on-one. And that Midrash is being taken hyper literally here, in which now we're understanding, okay, each nation has an angel that is overseeing it. And what it means when it says a new king arose over Egypt is actually not king per se, but the idea that there's a new angel appointed over Egypt at this time. Right, so one came off the factory line, gets sent to Egypt, and as a result, everything changes. Not about a human king at all, about some divine and cosmic drama, typical for the Zohar to make things about what's going on in heaven rather than what's going on earth.
Why did it need a new angel?
That's a great question. Why did the old angel get fired? How do we remove angels when they're done representing a nation? It doesn't really explain that. And it's not interested in that. What is interested in it is trying to give us an interpretation of this verse. By the way, there's an idea in Hebrew and in biblical interpretation of what's called Peshat, which means the simple interpretation, what it actually means. The Zohar does not care about Peshat, right? So it is not looking at this and thinking, oh yes, a new king arose. It actually means an angel. It's assuming that the Torah is not actually what it says it's not what it says it means, but there's actually a deeper level of meaning that you have to dig a little bit and have to decode. So Zohar is always going to assume that when it says X, it means Y, right? The assumption of mysticism in general is that nothing is as it seems. So we shouldn't be too critical where we go, well, it says king, not angel, because the Zohar doesn't matter. King is obviously just a code here. Whether we buy that, different question, but we have to at least understand where they're coming from with it.
Would the implication be that every time there's a new leader or a new monarch, there would always be a new angel to go with that?
Maybe. Right, a really interesting idea, perhaps, that when there's a change in leadership on the human realm, there's also a change in leadership on the divine realm. I don't know what that means for Britain. There's been a lot of angels changing the last few years, I suppose, up in heaven representing Britain. Also, I wonder if it represents Britain or England, or how many nations get an angel specific to them. They don't really go into the details logistically of that, but I think you might be onto something there, Lee, about the idea that there's some correlation. One of the general assumptions in mysticism is that things match, that there's correspondence. You famously hear in a lot of Western texts the phrase as above, so below, right? That things happen the same above and below. And that is probably what's being implied here. That it says a new king arose over Egypt. Yes, a new pharaoh rose over Egypt. But the important thing is the corresponding change in the angelic emissary who represents Egypt up in heaven, which is a weird way to read it. But a very Zohar way.
I think at the rate we've gone through prime ministers, you'd need to be making more than one a day.
Probably. There were a couple of days there where it would have been some really fresh angels showing up to the podium in the sky. Outside of the whatever the equivalent is in heaven of 10 Downing Street. Okay, let's carry on. So that's what we need to know, is that they're assuming that that's how we should read that verse. Beverly, do you want to read on a bit further?
Sure. Who did not know Joseph? For he issued from the place of separation, as it is said, from there it divides. And the first to separate is the river of Egypt. So who did not know Joseph, place where all union abides, called righteous?
Okay, I'm going to largely ignore this. What this is a hint to their understanding of the Sefirot. We're not going to get too engaged in the Sefirot right now. The Sefirot are kind of metaphysical entities that are either understood as instruments of God or organs of God. Joseph is a stand-in for one of them in particular, which is the penultimate one, often called Yesod, sometimes called Tzedek, which is about unification. Right, it's a place where all the other Sefirot unify before they then emerge into the world. It's often also associated with genitalia and hence linked to Joseph and his sexual restraint and all sorts of other interesting imagery. We don't need to get too into that, but the point is Joseph is actually a stand-in for this Sefirah of Yesod. And the point they're making when it says the angel did not know Joseph is that the angel was from a place of division, not of unification. So we're very abstract now. And Egypt, of course, is understood as a place of division. Why? Largely because of geography, right? Egypt itself, the word Mitzrayim in Hebrew, which is the description for Egypt, is a dual form word, ayim. And it refers to the fact that Egyptian society has always existed on either side of the Nile River banks. So there's very little. Egypt is like Canada. Most of it is empty. There's a lot of population in a small area, which are two long, thin strips on either side of the Nile River. So inherently, when the Hebrew imagination thinks about Egypt, it thinks about it as a divided place. Literally, there's a line that goes down the middle of Egypt, which is the Nile River. So Egypt is a place of division. The angel who represents Egypt is an angel of division, but Joseph is a symbol of unity and unification because of this connection to the Sefirot. So all that matters for us right now is that we understand that they're interpreting the words, who did not know Joseph, the second half of the verse, a new king arose in Egypt, as meaning that the angel that came over and was now assigned the task of representing Egypt didn't know anything about this unification that Joseph represented. That's not so important to where we're going with the story, but hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Right, so we've had a teaching, a midrash teaching, and now we're going to jump to a story that's going to come back to the teaching. Very typical for the Zohar. It just jumps right to a tangent. By the way, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi, who's going to be in our story. Now, you will have noticed Rabbi Yossi was the one who gave us that teaching that Beverly just read for us at the beginning. So obviously there's some link in that we heard the teaching, and now we're going to hear about a story related to one of the protagonists of that teaching. And this is very common that the stories begin with two rabbis going for a walk, having a chat. That's where all the magic happens, it seems. So someone else want to read from Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi? Would love for lots of people to have a chance to read, if you're so inclined.
Okay.
Yay! Thank you.
Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi were walking on the way. They'd set out by early light. They saw a star shooting from one side and a star shooting from the other side. Rabbi Elazar said, "The time has now come for morning stars to praise their master, and they are racing in fear and awe of their master to praise and sing to him. As is written, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of Elohim shouted for joy, for they all praise him in unison."
Okay, let's just get our bearings a little bit. What's happening here in regular language?
I don't know.
Shooting stars in two different directions.
Yeah, right. Weird thing to see, I imagine. It's very early in the morning, right? They've gotten up for an early morning jog, let's say. They're trying to get fit. It's January, new year. And they're out there walking early in the morning. It's not quite light yet. And they see these shooting stars, one from one side and one from the other side. And this prompts Rabbi Elazar to give this lovely little teaching, which is, by the way, no connection to what we read before, but it will, about how, look, it must be time for the morning stars to praise God. And they're running around. They're so excited. They're in fear of God. They're in awe of God. They're running around to praise God. And by the way, there's a verse about this. Right. So that's obviously what rabbis are always trying to do, is connect their real world experience to a verse in the Tanakh. And lo and behold, he's got one from the book of Job, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of Elohim shouted for joy. Right. Lovely kind of verse, allows him to interpret what he's seeing around him and allows him to understand natural phenomenon, that is shooting stars passing around, as actually linking to an understanding of what's being described in the book of Job. Okay, so hello, Claire. Welcome.
Hello. Sorry, I was. Hang on.
That's okay.
I've just come back from the States, and I just thought I'd take an afternoon nap, but it turned out to be a lot longer. So apologies for joining late.
That's all right. There's never too late. We're just in the midst here of this passage, which Lee is just reading for us, in which we have Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi going for an early morning walk, seeing some shooting stars and trying to understand what it might mean. So first they quoted this verse from Job, and now we're going to see where he goes on next. just to point out some language here, right? Rabbi Elazar, it's going to use this language, he opened. This is a very common language for the Zohar. It describes the act of interpreting the Torah as opening something. You're opening up the meaning of the verse. And what these rabbis are largely doing when they interact is actually taking a verse or several and trying to open up new meanings to it. It's a value of actually trying to innovate the Torah. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to be creative. It is an inherently creative enterprise. So Lee, let's see what he's going to do with some more verses.
He opened saying, "For the leader on the doe of dawn, a song of David. The doe of dawn, for when the face of the east lightens and the darkness of night dissipates, there is a deputy on the east who draws a thread of radiance from the south until the sun emerges, bursting those windows of the sky and illuminating the world. That thread-thin ray parts the dark of night. Then the doe of dawn approaches, black radiance in..." Where are we?
The top of the left-hand column.
"Black radiance in darkness coming to conjoin with the day. And day shines, its radiance encompassing, absorbing that doe. Concerning this doe, as she parts from the day after being encompassed, David sang a song, as is written, for the leader on the doe of dawn. And what did he say? My God, why have you abandoned me? For the doe of dawn had parted from the radiance of day."
Okay. Feels like we're not talking about shooting stars anymore, yeah?
Yep.
What are we talking about?
Sunrise.
Yes, so we're absolutely right. We are describing a natural event, the sun rising. The language is amazing, right? So we have this language of the east lightens and the darkness of night dissipates, and there's a deputy in the east who draws a thread of radiance from the south until the sun emerges, bursting those windows of the sky and illuminating the world. Beautiful way to talk about sunrise, right? You know, Henry David Thoreau, eat your heart out. But there's also this verse from chapter 22 of the book of Psalms, which, you know, probably isn't that well known to most of us, but it begins with this unusual language, on the doe of dawn. Strange language. And obviously they're reading in a particular way, right? They're looking at this word doe of dawn. Doe, of course, being a female deer. I think we all know the song, doe, a deer, a female deer, right? And the doe of dawn, they're understanding as referring to a particular thing. So they understand this thread-thin ray parts the dark of night. The doe of dawn approaches black radiance in darkness. So she is black radiance in darkness, coming to conjoin with the day. Conjoin, obviously, has a slightly sexual implication. And day then shines, its radiance encompassing, absorbing that doe. There's this kind of imagery of intermixing and combination and interaction, right? And at the end of the day, as the doe parts from the day after being encompassed, again, kind of penetrative language, David sang a song. That's the song we began with. He is opening the song of Psalm 22 on the doe of dawn. The question, of course, is what's the next verse? Verse 2 is, my God, why have you abandoned me? Right? That's the next verse in that psalm. So the psalm begins, for the leader on the doe of dawn by David, my God, why have you abandoned me? And the explanation is the doe of dawn had parted from the radiance of day. Now, who knows their Hebrew grammar? We're talking about Laila and Yom. What's different about those two words?
Laila is feminine, Yom is masculine.
Thank you, David. All right. So we're talking about night and day, feminine and masculine. And indeed, they are using imagery, which is not surprising to those who have looked at the Zohar and Kabbalah before, in which they're understanding natural phenomenon, that is the intermixing of day and night at dawn and at sunset and at sunrise, and the emergence and change in the sky, as being an inherently sexualized metaphor for the interaction between the masculine and the feminine. Now, this is not terribly surprising if you spent any time with the Zohar, because you might know the Zohar is kind of obsessed with the idea that everything can be understood as a binary between masculine and feminine. However, what's important about that, and what we see here, and what's probably something that's not obvious to those who have not looked at this before, is that actually all the time we spend in the Zohar talking about masculine and feminine is actually not about masculine and feminine per se, not about human bodies, about genitalia, about gender as we know it. It's about the idea of opposites. and the relationship between them. We already saw the discussion of division and unity with the angel who oversees Egypt not knowing Joseph. Here we see the idea of these two opposites, right? We think about night being darkness, being feminine, and day being masculine, being shining, being radiant, active, right? That these things are actually representative of essentialized opposites, which can be called masculine, feminine, night and day, light and darkness, whatever you want to call them. It doesn't actually matter what you call them, but the idea is that there's essentially two manifestations of phenomenon which interact and interweave within each other, and which also applies to God. And this is the real crazy chidush or innovation of the Zohar, is that it understands God as actually being something which is both masculine and feminine. And it uses lots of explicit language for that. It'll often refer to the Holy Blessed One, or Tiferet, which is the masculine God, and it'll refer to the Shekhinah, or the Matronita, language we'll see in a little bit, as the feminine God. And it doesn't mean that there's two gods, right? I really want to emphasize that for those who might be new to the Zohar. Zohar is not suggesting that there is two gods. What it is suggesting is that God can be understood as, to our point of view at least, split into masculine and feminine aspects, which themselves interact in ways that we can understand by observing nature. Many ways, if you grew up in a conventional Jewish environment and went to a conventional Jewish cheder and were told that Judaism is about ethical monotheism, seeing some rabbis from the 2nd century looking at the dawn and talking about it as an interaction between the feminine and the masculine, the night and the day, might seem overwhelmingly pagan to you, and indeed in some way it is. But hopefully the point that you can take away is not that this is a problem, but that actually Judaism is more complex than we often see. And that Judaism, including normative Judaism, such as the Zohar, includes lots of things which might feel very pagan, right? Not only the observation of nature, but the essentialized gender interpretation of those opposites as masculine and feminine entities.
Does this also suggest that, I mean, just from the end of it there, it seems to suggest that the Shekhinah is David's God, as opposed to the rest?
Yes, I think that there is a piece of this which is looking at the personal relationship with God. And actually, it's not so much that it's David's God per se, Lee. It's more that it's humans' God, right? So the Zohar, it's not saying it here, but you see it as you read more and more and more. Basically, to oversimplify it, understands that when most of us talk about God, that is the God that we encounter, the God that we experience, the God that we can know and feel and have some sense of, what we're actually talking about is the feminine. Every time, right? The feminine, the matronita, the Shekhinah, the doe of dawn, as it's referred to metaphorically here, that is the God that we can know and relate to, and actually the one that is spoken about by David in the Psalms and many other places. The masculine God, the father figure, is actually much more removed and far away, and someone who isn't really known by people. It's more the unknowable, transcendental God, whereas the feminine is the immanent and accessible God. So yes, David is understood to be talking here about the Shekhinah when he says, "Why have you abandoned me?" But also notice the duplication of his language, right? They're seeing the language Eli, Eli, my God, and understanding that to mean actually that he's kind of talking about both. That by duplicating it, he's hinting to us that the problem of the night is not that it's the night, but that the night and the day are separated. And this is really, really key. The Zohar generally sees the problems of the world, both material problems and cosmic problems, as being the result of masculine and feminine being separated. Our job as humans is to unite them, is to take opposites, whether we understand them as masculine and feminine, day and night, light and darkness, up and down, hot and cold, whatever you consider them as, to take opposites and unite them together. That's ultimately the kind of mystical mission the Zohar has for humanity. They understand that many different ways, but that's the long and short of it. And there's lots of ways in which the Zohar understands that as we are the children of kind of separated parents, and our job is to try and reunify them. You can understand this psychologically, in kind of Freudian terms, or cosmically in kind of very religious terms, but it's ultimately something that is completely consistent across the entirety of the Zohar. And probably the main thing that the Zohar is adding to Jewish discourse is this idea of God being bifurcated into a mother and a father.
Is there something also important then in since the day begins at sunset that the Shekhinah comes first?
Very
in a
good.
chronological sequence.
Yes, absolutely. I love that, right? So we make the weird choice in Judaism to count the day as beginning in darkness. The reason, of course, is the midrashic understanding of the very first lines of Genesis, in which it says, and there was evening and there was morning, day one. So we read that very literally and go, okay, day one was evening, then morning. So days must start in the evening and then the morning. And so, yes, we start our days when it gets dark, right? When the doe of dawn flees. And halfway through the day, in the morning, they are reunited. And by the end of the day, they're separated again. So it's this dynamic of separation and unity. But absolutely, it also means that we're closer to, we start with, our origin is with the feminine, kind of great mother imagery that you'll see talked about in psychology. That's where our root is in. In case it's not obvious, we're quite a long ways from, what's in most Intro to Judaism textbooks. So for those who are here and studying for conversion, don't get too carried away, because it's still got to be in contrast with conventional and normative Judaism, but it's meant to criticize it by offering this alternative. And it is very alternative. Right, so our rabbis are still going to walk. Lee, will you read a little bit more for us, and then we'll jump to someone else?
As they were walking, the day lightened and the time for prayer arrived. Rabbi Elazar said, "Let us pray and walk on." They sat down and prayed. Afterward, they rose and walked on.
Right. Notably, of course, the shacharit prayer, the morning prayer, can only be said once it's after dawn, once there is enough light to see by. So you can see actually the way that practice, the actual prayer these rabbis are stopping to do, combines with their theology and their understanding of nature. It's all interlinked, that they're stopping to pray at the moment that they see the doe of dawn arriving, that is the sky lightening and interacting and the day and night mixing. It's the mixing that happens at dawn and at sunset, which are so interesting to them, because that's when there's unity between day and night, masculine and feminine. Okay, so that was Rabbi Elazar's first teaching in this passage. Now we're going to jump to another teaching he has, and they're going to try and link it together, but they seem unrelated at first, as usual. So someone else want to read for us from this second part? I'm going to highlight in yellow. Janice, is that you?
Yeah, that's me.
Go
Right.
on.
Rabbi Elazar opened, saying, "There is Haval, futility that occurs on earth. There are righteous people who are treated according to the conduct of the wicked, and there are wicked people treating according to the conduct of the righteous. I say that this too is futility."
Okay, just to point out, by the way, sorry, Janice, before you go on, this entire thing we just read is a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes, right, aka Kohelet, and it's maybe one that we don't read that often. We only read the book on Sukkot, but we have a sense here of pointing out what is probably obvious to most of us, which is that lots of good people seem to have lots of suffering, and lots of bad people seem to be flourishing in the world. Ecclesiastes is aware of this and points this out and calls this hevel, a word which is itself very hard to understand, which is often translated as vanity or futility or vapor or breath or intransience. There's lots of ways you can translate it, and no one has a good way on how, but it's a word that is used constantly in the book of Ecclesiastes. It is his favorite word, and we're going to see, according to Zohar, why.
Right, okay. This verse has been established and discussed, but there is Haval. King Solomon composed this book and based it on 7 Habalim, breaths upon which the world subsists, namely 7 pillars, supports of the world corresponding to the 7 heavens. And it's got Vilon, I can't read those bits.
That's okay.
Corresponding to them all. And then it's got Haval, Habalim, Haval, Havarim, Habal, Habarim. Breath of breath, all is breath.
Very nice. Right. So a couple of things are happening here, right? They're trying to interpret this word hevel that's used in the book of Ecclesiastes, and they're pointing out a number. That number is 7. Anytime you see 7, you know that there's something exciting is happening, because 7 is the number of perfection in Jewish mysticism, and indeed even in conventional non-mystical Judaism. That's because of creation story, of course. In 7 days, world is created, so 7 is perfection, and which, quite different from our Western conception of numbers, by the way. So the point is they're connecting 7 Havalim. They only tell us later how they get that, which is that in the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, Havel Havalim, Havel Havalim, Hakol Havel. How do they get 7 from this? Havel is 1, and Havalim, that's the plural, is 2. So 1 plus 2 is 3, plus 1 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus the last one is 7. Hakol Havel. Right? So the word Havel they understand to be repeated 7 times there, which they understand as a hint put there by Ecclesiastes to the idea that there are 7 breaths which structure the world, which is a really interesting idea. Breath is one word that we could use here. There are many others we could use. Again, that word havel could be translated many ways. We could say vapors. We could say, fleeting things. The idea is that something temporary and insubstantial that disappears before it's even appeared. And they're connecting this here to this idea, again, a very old midrashic idea, that there are 7 heavens. There are 7 layers of heaven, like an onion. And they all have great names: Vilon, Rakia, Shechakim, Zevul, Ma'on, Machon, and Aravot. Now, what's not said here, but which maybe is not obvious either, is that earlier in rabbinic literature, that is all the way back in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, a lot of Jewish mysticism focused on the idea that in a trance type state, one could travel to these 7 heavens and explore them. And there's whole books written about rabbis and their meditative journeys as they took drugs and went into trances and explored the 7 heavens and which one they got to and what they saw when they got there. It's a wild body of literature, often known as Heichalot, or heavens, or palaces. And this is something that the authors of the Zohar know of and have at their disposal. And to them, it's totally normal and conventional to say that there are 7 heavens, and they're connecting that to the 7 times that the word havel, or breaths, is mentioned in this passage. The other 7, which is not obvious, is part of the Sfirot. There are 10 Sfirot, but they're conventionally divided into 3 on the top, which are above our understanding, and 7 below, which are the ones which we interact with. Those 7 below, by the way, are often split into masculine and feminine. The 7 represent masculine and feminine, mother and father, prince and princess, king and queen, day and night, whatever binary you choose.
Breath also comes up a lot in Sefer Yetzirah as well, doesn't it?
It does. Very good, right? So the focus on breath, on meditation, on using the breath as the power of speech and speech as the vehicle creation is very much linked to this. These 7 worlds, these 7 heavens are also linked by the fact there's 7 breaths. Each breath creates something anew, right? Which is a lovely idea, actually, the idea that each breath is linked to one of the heavens. Like you could think about each time God speaks in Genesis, each time there's a breathing, another thing is created, right? For each of the 7 days of creation, God speaks each time, which is, of course, linked very closely to breathing. Okay. Janice, do you want to do one more little... Sorry.
So I
Lauren.
just wanted to ask, but this 7 heavens is not just a Kabbalistic idea or a Zohar idea. The 7 heavens also exist in other parts of Judaism. The rabbis traveled to 7 heavens. Is that...
Yes.
Or is that... Yes, okay.
Yeah, so it's a very old idea, which is shared by Christianity, by the way. Who came up with it first? I'm not clear on, but it's an idea that emerges in the rabbinic period that is kind of 0 to 200, that there are actually 7 heavens. And again, it's very much linked to this idea of correspondence, because they also believe there were 7 earths, that there were 7 layers to the earth, and that if you dug down, you'd go down to another world below, and another world below, and another world below. And there's stories in the Talmud about creatures who lived in the 4th earth down, who emerge onto the ground, and the rabbis meet them, and they've got like 3 heads, and there's wild stuff that is part of rabbinic legend and myth, which again is part of our tradition, is central to our tradition, but these days when Judaism is portrayed as ethical monotheism is often ignored. I would endorse the idea that you literally have to believe there's 7 earths and 7 heavens, because I think scientifically that's quite questionable, but mythologically it was taken for granted for a long time that that's what Jews believed. It only seems strange to us because we've tried to modernize ourselves and get rid of all this fun stuff.
Right, shall I carry on?
Yeah, let's just do the next little paragraph and then we'll switch to someone else.
Just as there are 7 heavens, there are others adjoining them, expanding, issuing from them. Similarly, there are other breaths, expanding, issuing from these, all mentioned by Solomon.
Great. So they're just really throwing a wrench or a spanner in the works here as we think about this idea of seven heavens, because then they're going on to say, by the way, there's even more, right? It's endless. And this is a common feature of mysticism, and the Zohar in particular, is the idea that it believes there are basically infinite number of worlds, dimensions, realities, something which we don't usually talk about, of course, in most Jewish spaces, but which is assumed by the Zohar, that there's just lots of different versions of reality, and actually often more than we could possibly count or comprehend, which is a hard idea for us. In many ways, contemporary cosmology and physics says the same thing and talks about this a lot, kind of multiple dimensions and realities, and how there might be more realities than we even can understand. And that's really where the Zohar is coming at it from too, is this kind of cosmological sense of complexity.
There's also a kind of worldly sense to it as well, in that, so it says sorry, all mentioned by Solomon. Going back to Kohelet describes like all these different sort of dualities and these different combinations of states of like pleasure and pain and so on. And all of those different states, that when you're in a particular emotional state, that influences the way you perceive the world you're in. So that then becomes the world in a sense.
Yeah, no, I think that it's very much true that Kohelet is expansive in his understanding, I assume his, maybe hers, understanding of the world, right? Kohelet only uses the word Elohim to refer to God, never the Tetragrammaton. Kohelet never really talks about Israel or Judaism or anything specific to the Jewish people. It is a very worldly book. And the portion you're referencing, made famous by the song by the Byrds in the 1960s, of a time for life, a time for death, a time to cry, a time to heal, etc. There's a whole list of them in chapter 3 of Kohelet, which very much sets up this idea of binaries, and of the idea that the world is structured through opposites which interact, and also of multiple realities which coexist. And it's a beautiful, obviously poetic passage, but also is taken here very seriously. By the way, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, is not taken very seriously by the mainstream rabbinic tradition. It's seen as actually like borderline heresy. But for the Kabbalah, for Zohar, Kohelet is taken very seriously, partially because Solomon's reputation for having written it, true or not, and partially because there's lots of material there which supports the idea that it wants to suggest about how we understand the world. Right, let's read on a little bit more. Who else wants to read for us from Here Lies a Mystery of Wisdom?
I will.
Please, Paula.
Here lies a mystery of wisdom. There is a breath issuing from those supernal breaths upon which the world subsists, and this is actualized on earth, sustained, vitally empowered, potently by earthly action. Sorry, I have to make it a bit bigger. And by ascent rising from earth. This is appointed over earth, all its power and vitality derived from souls of the righteous plucked from earth while they are pure, before they have decayed, while still emitting fragrance. Like Enoch, of who is written, and he was no more, for God took him, taking him before his time had arrived, delighted in him, and so with the other righteous of the world, for we have learned.
Let's just go on and do this paragraph, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Top of the left-hand column here.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm just moving along. Sorry. For the
That's
two
okay.
reasons the righteous are removed before their time. One, for sins of the generation, because when the wicked abound in the world, the righteous found among them are seized for their sins. Another, when it is revealed before the blessed Holy One that they will decay later on. He removes from the world before their time, as is written. There are righteous people who are treated according to the conduct of the wicked, judgment from above befalling them, as if they had committed sins and acts of the wicked.
Okay, so we're coming back to the key question that was asked. it took us a while to get there, which is basically, why do bad things happen to good people, right? A question that's central to any religious discussion. We got there through first this kind of naturalistic understanding of the dawn, and then through this understanding of Ecclesiastes and the seven heavens, and this idea of them each being breaths. And now we've expanded this mystery of wisdom. So they typically do this. They kind of take multiple verses and explode different ideas and then try and collect it all together. And what is it that they're suggesting here? And there's lots going on in this passage that Paul has just read for us. What is the mystery of wisdom that they're endorsing about the breath?
It's like a no beginning, no end. There isn't an end.
Okay. Say more.
Well, just because of the way it's written, before they have decayed, while they are still emitting fragrance, they took him before his time and arrived and delighted in him. So there isn't really an ending there. There's
I think, yeah, very good. Who is Enoch, and what are they talking about when they say they took him before his time? Who knows what this is referencing? Go on, Daniel.
Wasn't he an angel?
Oh, sorry, Nina. He does kind of become an angel, but how does he get there, Daniel? What's the story?
Enoch is it taken by a kiss from above, and he's made into Metatron, so he becomes like an archangel.
Yeah, good. So we got the bits here. All of it is reliant on a very, very specific biblical verse, which they quote here, Genesis 5:24. Enoch is one of, to be honest, not that interesting, one of the ancestors described as we lead up to the Noah story, and we follow up all of the things going on in the background of Genesis. They mention a guy named Hanoch, or Enoch, and it says about him, all the other people, it says, and they lived this long, and they died, and they lived this long, and they begot this and that. About Enoch, it says, and he was no more, which is weird. Well, why does the Torah say that? So it says, for God took him. So the rabbis ask, why does the Torah about this one guy said he was no more, for God took him? And what does that mean? And the explanation they give is that actually he didn't die. He was taken alive up into heaven and given a role as an angel. So he was kind of turned into an angel, which is obviously very strange imagery for us and feels in many ways very foreign to our understanding of Judaism. But then again, what about this happened this evening? And this idea of Enoch, a human being who was taken alive, taken to heaven, and turned into an angel, is not one unique to the Zohar. This is rabbinic midrash, goes all the way back to the earliest days of rabbinic Judaism. So this is not a new idea. So let's say that we accept that idea, that sometimes really good people are taken while they're still alive and abducted from the earth in order to then be taken off to heaven. What is it suggesting about their souls and how that functions with the world? This is the really crazy part, right? We have this imagery of breath issuing from the supernal breath. So there's all these breaths above, there's a breathing, there's expansion. Yeah, Janice, what's going on?
We have good souls, and I've said this before, that the breath is like your spirit within you. It's what makes you unique. Yeah. And perhaps they take people before their time, so people die early. Often you have good people die early and you wonder why. Perhaps they've gone off to be angels.
So very good. So perhaps like Enoch, they've gone off to be angels. Even more than going off to be angels, it understands almost, and it's hard to really get a grasp on what's being said here, but this idea of there's breath issuing from the supernal breaths on which the world subsists, right? So let's just think about what that means, right? That actually the world itself, the reality that we inhabit, is actually kind of breathing. It operates through breathing. Now, this isn't hard for us to understand because our life itself, is dependent on breath. You stop breathing, you are no longer alive. Breath is life. As you say, Janice, that is central to the Torah, to Judaism. Breath is life. That is equation which is not hard for us to understand. But here we have the idea that the world itself, the universe, breathes, that it breathes in and out, that there's actually a process of expansion and contraction, which, by the way, again, is what you'll see in any cosmological textbook today, is the Big Bang and the Big Crunch. The universe breathes. It goes in and out and in and out and in and out. And the Zohar is suggesting that actually the world works through this kind of breathing process, which is what Kohelet's trying to hint to us, and that the fuel, the energy that powers the breathing of the universe is what? All its power and vitality is derived from the souls of the righteous plucked from earth while they are still pure. So the universe's own internal energy mechanics, we could say, are actually powered by the souls of those who die before their time, which is both kind of beautiful and kind of horrifying. And that's a common binary we experience with the Zohar. It's like, like it's not a bad idea. And it's actually something that I've never heard of before reading this. The idea that we actually understand the universe as living and breathing. And that breath and that life, that power, the energy that's used in order to power that is actually from the righteous themselves. Those who are good people actually help to power the universe. That gives them a huge amount of power. It's very empowering to suggest that the righteous are the ones who power the universe, who provide the energy and fuel for it. But it also is quite dependent, it appears, on their being plucked while they're still fresh. We have this imagery of kind of fruit, right? While they still emit fragrance before they start to dry out and shrivel and decay.
Would that phrase as well about the breath and it being actualized on earth relate to the idea of like we manifest what we speak? So
not here. Not here. It's not necessarily at all giving us a language for talking about our own actions and our own breath. It seems much more as though we're talking about this idea of kind of cosmological breath. And I think we should understand it very abstractly, obviously. There's no lungs in the universe, but the idea of kind of expansion and contraction and that there's an energy and a dynamism, right? I just want to take us back because we're almost out of time. And we've seen lots of different things. I hope this has been a good survey introducing us to some of the ideas of the Zohar. But remember where we started, right? Where we started, just to scroll back a bit, is this idea about interpreting this random verse from Exodus that seems to be about a completely political and mundane situation as actually being about the idea that God is creating new angels all the time. Not God made all the angels and then they're entering the world, but actually there's a constant changeover. The angels are being made and they're sent to earth. Again, we've just heard the story of Enoch, and we're perhaps thinking about how are angels made? Maybe some of them are humans, as someone suggested, I think Janice, about maybe those righteous who die before their time are actually turned into angels, and those are the new angels who are being made all the time by God, who are then being sent back to the earth, which is itself kind of, again, a beautiful and kind of scary idea. So we have this cohesive interpretation of something which seems very strange about this idea of angels being made all the time, which then links on to this naturalistic understanding of opposites, right? Of feminine and masculine, day and night, and their comparison and the inherent binary between them and their unification. And then this teaching about breath and the 7 breaths that represent the creation of the world and the breathing that goes on after that sustains the world. And the fact that that breathing is actually powered by the souls of those righteous who die before their time, the people who we might feel did not deserve the fate they had, who we wanted to have more time. We might be comforted by thinking that perhaps they are part of this mechanism of the universe, which is powered and breathes through the righteous and their souls. It's a very weird way of thinking about theology, about religion, about the world. And if I, an hour ago, had sat you down and told you Judaism believes that the righteous who die before their time are actually fuel for the universe, which is breathing, and which is breathing in the way that it makes new angels out of those souls that then enter the world and have all these actions where they help the day and night to combine together as male and female in some kind of sexual union, you would have told me I was absolutely bonkers. But here we have spent nearly an hour looking at a text which is, I guarantee to you, and I assure you, this is not marginal. This is normative mainstream Judaism. The Zohar has been accepted by almost every Jewish community in the world, even if they don't study it that much. Most people think it to be legitimate. And yet it has all these crazy and wild ideas, which are very different from what we usually understand when we think about Jewish theology. And that is the purpose of studying it. I don't need you to walk away and believe that the universe breathes. I don't necessarily endorse the idea that if there's someone in your life who you feel has been taken too early, that their soul is being used to power the universe's lungs, although I don't think it's the worst idea for explaining and answering that question. I don't know it's the best either. But what I'm interested in is the way this challenges our perception of what Judaism is. Because here you have mainstream rabbis and a mainstream text giving us ideas which actually feel very alternative, and perhaps are not. Any last questions before we go? Yeah, Janice.
Is it almost saying reincarnation here?
Well, it definitely is hinting at it, and we'll see elsewhere reincarnation being hinted at. And indeed, reincarnation is a central part of the Zohar and of Kabbalah, a type of reincarnation that is quite different from what we usually understand, but is often called Gilgul, or cycling, and describes souls having multiple incarnations into the world in different forms. So yes, there might be a little hint of that here, but it actually is going to go into depth in it elsewhere, perhaps some of which we'll see in future weeks. So please come back in 2 weeks' time. And hopefully every other week we'll be able to continue this. As we see more of the Zohar, you'll see more of the connections, and we'll get more of a picture of really how crazy and also really exciting sometimes a text it can be. Thank you guys for joining me. If you haven't joined the WhatsApp group, please do, because that's where we'll post information and I'll share the recordings. And that's also where the Zoom link will be. The Zoom link will stay the same. But if anyone else you know would like to join us, just send them to the WhatsApp group, and that way we know who's joining us. Lovely to see some new faces as well who haven't done this before. Sorry if I've completely ruined your perception of Judaism. And if I haven't, come back in 2 weeks and we'll keep doing the same.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Cool.
Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.